This is an RNZ podcast.
Hello, hello. Hello, hello.
Hello.
Oh, I'm so sorry, Malcolm. I'm
That's
so
all right.
sorry to keep you waiting. To tell you that I was sitting on my deck with a cup of coffee and having a moment of deep existential dread about the state of the world. Not that you care about my existential dread, but what the fuck's going on?
Tell me.
I don't know. You're listening to Kim Hill Wants to Know, and this is, in fact, Kim Hill. Do you know what I was surprised to discover about you?
Yeah.
Do you? Kim Hill Wants to Know is a new podcast series where I have conversations with really some of the most interesting people. In this episode, I talk to Canadian journalist Malcolm Gladwell, best known for his bestseller The Tipping Point, How Little Things Can Make a Big Difference. 25 years on, Gladwell has a new book out reframing the lessons of that earlier book. It's called Revenge of the Tipping Point, Overstories, Super Spreaders, and the Rise of Social Engineering. And once again, his fascinating case studies illustrate his theories.
I'm of the group that says the future is tricky, not that the future is catastrophic. How's that?
Now, some call them just so stories in a sneering sort of a way, and I wanted to know whether he's essentially a clever magpie collecting shiny things or revealing new truths. Having spent many hours following Malcolm Gladwell down rabbit holes, I abandoned the idea of structure and just ran in. Let us talk about the tipping point. Revenge of the tipping point. We all know about the tipping point. Did you coin that phrase? I don't think you did. It was in another context and you adopted it. Is that right?
Correct. That was a phrase that had been used. I talk about it in this book. The origins of that phrase are real estate agents in the 1950s were using that to describe how neighborhoods were changing.
Yes.
They would reach a certain point. So yes, it had been floating around in the sociological literature, and then I popularized it.
So it was an idea that helped people think of changes as epidemics. Now, in your Revenge of the Tipping Point, you're doing the same-ish kind of thing, but from the underside.
Yes, that's the idea, that my perspective has shifted somewhat in 25
years.
And now I was interested in the ways in which people are used the rules of epidemics, principles of epidemics, to manipulate us or to quietly serve their own purposes, or to alter the course of change in a way that benefits them. If the first book was very optimistic.
Yes.
This book, less so.
Yes, although, in a way, I mean, let's talk about the magic third, for example, which is an idea that you explore in The Revenge of the Tipping Point. A threshold of population difference. You know, why having one woman among a whole bunch of men doesn't address gender discrimination, but if you have a third of whatever population it is, which is comprising women or blacks or Asians or whatever, something dramatic happens. Can you talk me through that?
Yeah, this is an idea around what they refer to around the problem of group proportions. And it begins with a very, very famous study that was done, I talk about in the book, that was done by a woman named Rosabeth Cantor back in the 70s. She was called in, she was a sociologist, called in by a big company that had just hired its first women in its sales staff. And the women weren't doing well. And they wanted to know why, because it didn't make any sense to them. So they called her in, they said, do a study. They talk to people, find out what's happening. And she does, and she comes back to them and says, the good news is the women you hired are all highly capable. The good news is there's nothing wrong with your company culture. You're not openly discriminating against them holding them down. The good news is that these women are not traumatized or, have some other issue. However, the only problem is you didn't hire enough women, that there's a difference. Her argument was that numbers matter when it comes to outsiders joining a group. And that when the number of the outsiders reach a certain critical mass, then the way in which people view the outsiders and the way in which the outsiders feel change dramatically. And this idea of shifting from a kind of diversity as something symbolic to diversity as something numerical is a crucial one, right? Because so often we think that when we have made a symbolic, when we've broken a barrier symbolically, we've finally brought in the outsider. We have, the all-male privilege has been ended. The all-white privilege has been ended. We think we have won the battle. And her point was, no, you haven't won the battle. That people get tokenized so quickly and profoundly when they are of insufficient numbers that you have to pay attention to how many of the outsiders are coming in.
There's the concept of benign quotas involved here. And you also discuss a housing scheme in Palo Alto, which is set up so that there are equal numbers of white, black, and Asian people, and each of each type could only sell on to the same. It's a practice of a mild discrimination, but so that a wider discrimination might be prevented. And this idea of benign quotas, are you arguing for quotas in these examples? Are you saying if Harvard, for example, which is another thing that you explore, if Harvard had the magic thirds, you would think that it was a much better institution than it is, but as it is, it discriminates?
Yeah, so the magic third is the idea I introduced to kind of clarify what I mean by critical mass. And so in the psychological literature and also kind of drawing anecdotally from various examples of outsiders breaching a previously homogeneous domain, it seems like once the outsiders number above somewhere between a quarter and a third of the total, then they get taken seriously. Then they feel like they could be themselves. Then they can have a voice, and then they can change the culture of the group they're joining. So that's why I call this the magic third. Something happens at a third. And I interviewed all these women who were on corporate boards, and they would be women who first they were the only woman on the board, and I would say, "What did that feel like?" And they said it made no difference. It was as if I wasn't there. And I'd say, "What happens when there was two women?" Made no difference. It was as if we weren't there. What happens when there were three? So 3 out of the 9 slots on the board were females. And they said, oh, then it was just like night and day. It was like all of a sudden we could be ourselves. We were treated as human beings. People would listen to what we had to say. That's the magic third. Am I arguing for quotas? Well, it's funny. I would have said before I wrote the book that I was very hostile to quotas because they seem like such a kind of blunt instrument, don't they? They belong to an earlier era. And now I'm kind of into them. Now, maybe not like the idea though that I want to find some mechanism for impressing on those in the majority that the work isn't done when you open the door to an outsider if you only let in one, right? That how many you let in is a crucial question. And if the quota is the way to make the majority live up to its responsibilities, then I guess I am in favor of the quota.
Is it an idea that can be applied, though? As you say, the man passed over for a job because the number of women in the company isn't yet at the tipping point, is unlikely to be satisfied by this.
Unlikely would be a very nice way of putting it, I think. Yeah.
And also, I
Yes.
mean, going back to your housing scheme in Palo Alto, a great idea, a perfect balanced community. But then you get a black person coming along wanting to buy a house from an Asian person or a white person, and no, they can't. They really need a house, but no, they can't. And as you quote the person who studied this, the grief and guilt feelings which are still expressed by other Negroes who had some feeling of having had to sacrifice one of their own race to prove a principle which in a well-ordered world should have needed no proving. It's this practice of a mild discrimination so that a vicious discrimination might be prevented calls upon a world with ethics that are seldom exhibited, right? Can we see this working anywhere?
Well, is it practical in the world we live in now? Hard to imagine. However, I do think that it is useful to instruct people on these dynamics, so that if I were the chairman of a board of a big company, and I had two women on my board, and we were considering we had a place on the board to fill, and I had learned about this literature which said that outsiders behave very differently when their numbers reach a third. That would be a useful thing for me to know when I made my decision about who I was going to bring onto the board, right? It would be, I don't think you necessarily should put a gun to the chairman's head and say you have to appoint a woman. But I think it would be really useful for the chairman to know that that group proportions are things that those who are interested in optimizing the performance of groups need to pay attention to, right? Or if a better example would be, suppose I was a firm engaged in some incredibly complex activity, trading, financial, trading of some kind, and it was very important for me to have a wide variety of intellectual perspectives in the room. Knowing about group dynamics would be really important, because one of the things we know is that sometimes when we have a group that we think is diverse, but the portion of the group where it's just one person who represents an outsider's perspective, they don't feel comfortable speaking up in times of crisis. They feel unheard and drowned out and what have you. That's pointless, right? We want them to. So it's in your interest, if you're running the group, to say, maybe I want three of you, not one of you, because then I'll get more out of you than I would if you were there in lesser numbers.
One of the things that The Revenge of the Tipping Point made me think was that it used to be a lot easier, if only we had known what we were doing, to socially engineer. And then I thought maybe not, because all you've got to do is put out a stupid tweet and, Springfield burns. Do you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. Let's. What I'm thinking of is your analysis of how the very popular television program Will and Grace could be argued to have changed people's views about homosexuality, or how Gunsmoke made Americans think that having guns and shooting people is in some way a normal thing to do. Let's start with Will and Grace, because if I wanted to make a society more liberal, I'd say, let's have this television program about a gay guy and his best girlfriend, and slowly persuade people that this was not an abnormal thing. Mm-hmm. That wasn't why it was created, but you argue that it was a revolutionary program in some way. Are you sure you're not reverse engineering that idea, though? Do you know what I mean?
Well, I'm trying to account for a puzzle that no one has a good answer for.
Well, why suddenly society, America, had a more liberal attitude towards gay marriage?
Yeah. So this is one of the, this is, if you talk to people who are in the social change business, they will tell you that one of the most inexplicable and astonishing transformations in their lifetimes is how America went from a country that was actively on its seeming, actively resisting the notion of gay marriage. In fact, where both Congress and individual states were passing amendments to their constitutions, making it permanently illegal for people of the same sex to marry, where elections were being decided on this issue and people supporting gay marriage were losing, where there was where there was no social penalty whatsoever to someone standing up and saying and couching their opposition to gay marriage as a kind of social good. People would stood up and say, I am trying to protect the most precious institution we have. And, this is how I'm going to protect it, by preventing gay people from marrying each other. We went from that to a world where, like, the overwhelming majority of Americans supported gay marriage, and where the issue, it wasn't even that it was an issue anymore. It was that it seemed like something from 100 years ago that people were opposed to gay marriage. That transformation took 10 years. No one thought it would take 10 years. Everyone thought it would take 50 years, if it happened at all. So that's the puzzle. How does it happen? So what I'm doing in that chapter is, I wrote a chapter which said, okay, we know there was a very active political campaign, grassroots political campaign to change the minds of Americans. Everyone agrees that happened, that it was important, and that it was well run and effective. However, it clearly didn't tip the scales, right? No one thinks it tips the scales. So what else could have? And so I have become, I'm not the only one, many people are convinced that there was a large and hitherto unrecognized role played by the television show Will and Grace, which was just a sitcom based in young people in New York City, like all sitcoms are, where a gay man had a best friend who was a straight woman, and they had a kind of non-romantic love story. And I analyzed that story and walked through all the ways in which it was an extraordinarily revolutionary story. And so it was revolutionary in the sense that it treated homosexuality as normal, whereas previously, in really subtle ways, even in subtle ways, Hollywood had always treated homosexuality as pathological, problematic. And just the fact that a television show could run for 7 or 8 years that had that perspective, that just said, the only thing about Will, there's nothing about Will that is out of the ordinary or deviant or pathological or troubled. He just happens to be gay, right? I feel like that set the stage. That changed what I call the overstory around gay marriage, because it relieved people of the anxiety that they were somehow enshrining or bringing a group of deeply troubled people into the family structure, right? The family traditions of Western society. And that, I think that you add Will and Grace to the kind of grassroots political campaigns, and you begin to get an answer for this extraordinary transformation that happens so quickly.
I completely understand what you're saying, but you must wrestle constantly, surely, with, causation or correlation. Did the makers of Will and Grace, they were part of a society that was beginning to warm to the idea of homosexuality and gay marriage, and thus they were riding the same wave rather than instigating any kind of wave?
Well, I think it's a little bit of both. I mean, I think the reason that show was allowed to go in the air is that there was already a feeling in some corners of American society that gay marriage was an idea that, or at least, remember, the show had nothing to do with marriage. There was already a feeling in American society that there was an opportunity to talk about gay people as normal. So you're absolutely right. That show does not come from nowhere. It's building on a groundswell of the beginnings of a groundswell of support for the idea that gay relationships can be real, right? But so what it does is it's an accelerant, but an extraordinarily powerful accelerant because it's using television at a time when television could reach a huge percentage of American homes, and where that show ran on a weekly basis for 6 or 7 years, right? So you have a kind of powerful message being beamed out every week, year after year after year after year, and that that's not piggybacking on an existing trend. That's creating something, I think.
You explore these ideas, of course, in your podcast, Revisionist History, and I mentioned Gunsmoke. You go into that in a fascinating way. It was this series that ran and ran and ran, Dodge City, and led you suggest to the concept that, especially episode 8, right? Guns don't kill, gun control kills. And then we have Judge Alito that you suggest watched Gunsmoke when he was a kid and in some way absorbed this idea by osmosis. This is a great story. But is it true?
Well, I don't, what we're doing is, what I'm doing in those podcast episodes on my books is offering explanations for otherwise puzzling phenomenon. So you have to understand that both with the gay marriage transformation and with the gun thing, we're trying to deal with something, to explain something that cannot otherwise be explained. With the gun thing, the question is, why does America, alone among Western nations, have a ethic which is beyond accepting, which is welcoming of the notion that ordinary citizens should be able to carry incredibly lethal weapons around them with no restriction, right? Why does America feel that way? And Canada, across the border, does not, right? Same, they emerge out of the same set of historical traditions. They're both former British colonies. They occupy the same geography. And yet in Canada, it's unheard of.
Did Canada have Gunsmoke?
Well, no. So
it didn't.
So now we're getting to.
All right.
So you're forced to ask the question in trying to explain the different trajectory of Canada and the United States. What experiences did Americans have that Canadians did not? Now, there's many, but I find it hard to believe that the differences, the quite radical differences in the tenor of popular culture between those two countries did not play a role. Now, when you ask, is that right? We're not, I can't, no one who's trying to posit an explanation for an inexplicable phenomenon can tell you that their answer is right. I think it's useful to entertain this possibility. And I think being curious and exploring these kinds of possibilities helps you, I think, frame problems, understand them in a way you couldn't understand them before, and at least venture some partial explanations for things that otherwise would have no explanation at all.
It's a fascinating series, that podcast series you do on guns and violence and the American obsession with guns. And it sort of reverses all sorts of conventional wisdom. Turns out you say that assault rifles are not the most lethal weapon in mass shootings, and therefore handguns should be controlled too. It just presents one with this great mess of ill-informed and counter-effective ways of trying to solve the gun crisis. And you end up feeling that nobody's serious about it. Is that how you feel?
Not nobody, but I think there clearly are some who are very much. But I am.
But they're
I would
misguided
say
as
that
well. You argue they're misguided as well. Because in some ways, every control that is attempted to be brought about has an unintended consequence.
yeah, I guess the way I would phrase it is that the um, the magnitude of our interest and concern on this issue is um, is is uh, is out of step with the magnitude of the problem. In other words, I would think, given how large the problem is, that we'd be talking about it a lot more and be much more serious in coming up with solutions. And whenever there's a mismatch between the size of a problem and the size of our proposed solution, I think that calls for that's where journalists should step in and wave a flag and say, um, "Hold on, we need to look over here."
You've spoken about your own childhood. You had, arguably extraordinary parents. You've spoken about their adoption of Vietnamese refugees in a small town, and the idea of decency and kindness suffuses the way you talk about that. Can you see that what you're doing now in terms of examining how communities work and how they could work better stems directly from that childhood?
Funny. Well, now that's you've asked a question that generations of psychologists have struggled to
Not to mention
answer.
your year of Freudian analysis.
Exactly. Well, how could it not? I think is the short answer. Um, I don't think you can abstract someone's adult uh, um, preoccupations and beliefs from their experiences, their formative experiences. So, would I be a very different person had I not grown up in southwestern Ontario in farming country in Canada? Yeah, absolutely different. Yeah, I don't think there's any question about. I think more generally that I think of myself as being very Canadian in that sense. That I am acutely aware of the extent to which growing up in Canada has shaped who I am and the way I see the world. Many of the cliches about Canada, I think, have some truth. We are
Kind.
we are consensus building, boring, um, um, polite, boring. I'm joking about boring.
I know.
But it is a profoundly civil. Canada has a profoundly civil national culture, and that distinguishes it from its southern neighbor.
And yet there you are living in the United States.
I know. I don't think I thought about that before.
Yeah. And
What am I doing here?
what are you doing there?
Well, the full answer would be if America's ever going to change and reform its ways, it's only going to be because lots of people from better behaved countries like Canada move there and change things. So I could say that I would
How's that
justify my
going?
presence.
How's that going as a project?
We might need some more Canadians.
Aye.
But, if enough of us move down, maybe we can move the needle down here.
Do you think that the tipping point changed anything? I mean, I'm not trying to rain on your parade in any way, but I'm interested to know whether you think that the stories that you tell, the theories that you expound, the concepts that you introduce can change anything.
Well, if they did, I wouldn't know. Because a journalist is at the beginning of any kind of there's a long chain that leads from the way people think and talk about something or make sense of their world and the way they act. There are 10 steps in that chain. People like me occupy or play a role in the first step. So do I think that those kinds of books, like Tipping Point, change the kinds of conversations that people have with each other? Yes, I do. Do I think that those changed conversations are consequential? That they end up altering the actions people take down the line? I don't know. I hope so, but I have no evidence. And any writer who tells you that they think they are the cause of some kind of social social transformation is fooling themselves.
I mentioned the idea of social engineering before. If you thought, okay, we're going to change the way people think, let's make a program called Will and Grace, or we're going to turn America into a God-loving society. We'll make people sit by the television, watch Gunsmoke. Those days are gone. We don't gather around the fire of the television anymore. There is, you've said, some very good television being made, but if you sit next to somebody in the bus, they won't have watched what you watched last night. What we have is a kind of bananas world of social media where people race around and can change things with a misguided tweet.
Mm-hmm.
Does it work the other way? Can you change things with a really good tweet? Or is it all destructive and dysfunctional and fractionated now?
Well, I mean, I'm on Twitter. I am someone who thinks that there's an old adage in American football, the most important position is the quarterback. And there's an old adage that quarterbacks get far too much credit when their team wins and far too much blame when they lose. And I feel like Twitter is like a quarterback, gets way too much blame when things go bad and too much credit when things appear to be going well. I just don't think of it as being nearly as influential as people pretend.
Do you
people
not?
People on Twitter are powerfully predisposed to assume that Twitter has this transformational importance. But if you look at the actual numbers of, I am someone, I have 800,000 Twitter followers. If I look over the history of me tweeting, so whatever it is, 10 years, kind of given up recently, but in 10 years of tweeting to my 800,000 followers, I think I've had several tweets that quote unquote went viral, and I was able to see how many people liked them or reposted them. It's a trivial number. It's absurdly small. It's like a joke. It's like, why? I don't know why the amount of attention Twitter gets relative to its actual impact in the world. And then it's also people, I would be really interested if I was measuring impact in the duration of a message, as much of its range, right? I'm almost more interested in duration than range. I'd rather profoundly change the minds of 1,000 than reach 100,000 and have them all forget the next morning.
Yeah.
I think what Twitter's doing is a lot more of the latter and a lot less of the former. I think it's people just forget about it and move on. I don't think, I think it's so ephemeral. And, we're going to look back on this and say, why did we spend as much time as we did obsessing over this kind of silly, marginal social media platform?
Which is a problem in itself, because if we overstate the importance of Twitter, people shout on Twitter, they make these points and then somebody else picks them up and makes the same point. But as you say, small. It drains those people, often well-meaning people. It drains them of the energy to do something in the real world. Do you think?
I do. I wrote a piece for the New Yorker over 10 years ago, after the Arab Spring protests.
Yeah.
And during Arab Spring, as you may remember, there are many people who were convinced that that Twitter was fueling those protests, and that it was the arrival of Twitter that would allow ordinary
world to
citizens
become a better place. Everybody was going to live
and
happily ever after.
to rise up against
Yep.
autocrats and despots. And I wrote a piece for the New Yorker in which I said, come on, that's nonsense. And the opposite is happening, that people are not, because they can express their ideas and join causes so easily, are not engaging in the kind of hard work that it takes to build a social movement. And it's astonishing. I was so profoundly criticized for that piece. And it's one of those ones where I look back on and I think, you know what, I think I was the one who was right. The Arab Spring went away. Well, one of the reasons it went away was that in almost none of those countries did anyone succeed in building a kind of lasting institutionalized mechanism of resistance. And if you look at the successful revolutions, Castro in Cuba, the North Vietnamese in Vietnam, the civil rights movement in the United States, the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa, they are all people who painstakingly over many, many years built a bedrock of support and leveraged that support to change their society. But their time horizon was not 134 characters. It was a decade of community organizing. And that should be a powerful lesson to us that, we fall so in love with some of these technologies, and I just don't think they're that powerful.
I was looking at, I didn't hear it, presumably it was on audio, but there was a monk debate, organised between you and Alain de Botton on one side and Steven Pinker and Matt Ridley on the other, and the argument was, do humankind's best days lie ahead? And, of course, Steven Pinker and Matt Ridley said, we're doing really well, and poverty has fallen, and fewer people are starving, and technology is going to be fabulous. And you and Alain de Botton took the opposing side. And, I mean, I've spoken to Steven Pinker and Matt Ridley and found them deeply irritating because they have this kind of weird optimism that one wants to believe in, but is clearly self-serving in some peculiar way.
Yeah.
Are you still I don't even want to call it a pessimistic frame of mind. Do you think you are pessimistic?
No, I am by nature an optimist. Does that optimism mean that I think that the world is getting better and better? No. I think I'm probably an optimist in believing that we can probably solve more of our problems than we think. That it's not hopeless. It's a little tricky. I'm of the group that says the future is tricky, not that the future is catastrophic. How's that?
I just wanted to get back to the idea of, rather than being on Twitter, people should deal with an individual who needs help or kindness. And I was thinking of a lovely episode in your podcast where you talked about the Vietnamese refugees that your family and friends took in your small Ontario town. And years later, your brother, Jeffrey, who sounds like a wonderful, nice man, extended kindness to a young Syrian girl in his class. He was a school teacher, and she arrived deeply traumatized in his class. And when he spoke about the effect that he was able to have on her, he wept.
Mm-hmm.
And I was terribly moved by that, and I thought that must be some kind of bedrock of your familial belief, that to deal with a person with kindness and respect is the most important thing. Am I extrapolating too much here?
No, I think you've touched on, I think, something very important in the world that I grew up in kind of small town Ontario. that is absolutely how they would have defined the most important thing in our most important obligation we have. That's such a, when I talked about how important it is, how important my Canadianness is to me, I think it's important for precisely that reason, that I felt that I came from a culture whose values were intact and expressed and authentic.
Because
Canada,
Well,
okay.
because this is a long interview, I have a chance to go back and say something that I forgot to follow through earlier, which was, instead of 3 Vietnamese refugees, what if it was 10,000 or 20,000 Haitians?
Mhm.
And getting back to your benign quota, in a way, the intent is to be kind to thousands of refugees, but the outcome could be so disruptive that everybody suffers.
Mhm.
Is that something to think about?
Yeah. Is there a point at which the social upheaval that comes from letting in outsiders, lots of outsiders, is such that you have to draw the line? And the answer is yes, of course. Every single society in the world that has ever opened its doors to immigrants has realized that there's a limit to how many you can accept without incurring all kinds of domestic turmoil, right, on the part of the people who are already there. That's not what's at issue here. The issue is, okay, so where's that point? And can you raise that point by preaching ethics of compassion and tolerance? And I think you can, that you have an obligation to preach an ethic of tolerance and compassion. And if you do so, you can raise that number, whatever that threshold is. It can be raised if you create the right climate for welcoming outsiders. Canada, for example, as does Australia. I don't know about New Zealand, but Canada and Australia are two examples of countries that accept a hugely disproportionate number of refugees and legal immigrants relative to their counterparts around the world. So what's going on there? I mean, what's going on there is that they have managed to put cultures in place that encourage tolerance and compassion and openness and discourage kind of reflexive nativism and distrust of newcomers. And other countries just are not interested in preaching that message. The United States, for example, is a country whose willingness to accept refugees is basically shriveled up in the last decade or so. So I'm not, and to the extent that that threshold exists, I don't think anyone is even close to it around the world. Canada has, what does it have? I don't even know, 40, 50 million people. Canada could be a country of 500 million and not bat an eyelash. I have one of my favorite books ever written was by a guy named Matt Iglesias. It's called 1 Billion Americans. His point is America could easily have 1 billion people. Easily. It's not that hard to imagine. So like our threshold for absorbing newcomers, and by the way, we would probably in the end benefit so dramatically from those newcomers that all of our fears would turn out to be unfounded. What you're looking for, in other words, here is simply the kind of popular and political willingness to confront these issues and to create open minds. That's the limiting factor here, not the ability of countries to absorb outsiders.
Have you got politics? I mean, I'm assuming, because of the stories that you choose to tell and focus on, that you are a liberal. But you weren't always a liberal. You had conservative politics back at the University of Toronto, did you not?
Mm. I'm not I am liberal in some things and in other things not. I am a big free market person. I think markets work and they should be as free as possible. I think government shouldn't interfere with people's decisions. I think people should be able to build whatever they want on land that they own. I mean, I have lots of quite conservative ideas that I believe strongly about. I think borders should largely be open, but at the same time, I think that most 95% of prisons should be shut down, and I think that taxes should be way higher on the rich. So I have I suspect, a not uncommon mixture of beliefs about what would make a better world that don't necessarily conform along ideological lines.
No, and there probably isn't a political party that would attract your wholehearted support right now.
Well, right now, yes. Maybe next time.
What's weird is that there are people who are diehard Democrats in the United States at the moment, and they're thinking with deep nostalgia about people like Ronald Reagan and Bush.
Oh, yeah, who in retrospect seem
benign.
Yeah,
nice, benign, progressive,
yeah.
relatively liberal people. This is how far the needle has swung, I suppose.
Yeah.
And in terms of looking at social trends, do you think that sometimes the needle can swing so far that it can never swing back?
No, one of the reasons both this book and its predecessor, the original Tipping Point, are very much built around the idea that the world is permanently volatile. Volatility is the condition that defines human society, and there is no such thing as a permanent shift. That's not to say the pendulum always swings back the way that to exactly where it started from, but it just means that it swings, and it will swing in ways that will surprise us, and that it is far better to construct a worldview with that kind of volatility in mind than to pretend that where we are now is where we will always be. The only thing that we can be sure about is that we will not be where we are now in perpetuity.
Do you know what I was surprised to discover about you?
Yeah.
Do you? Can you imagine what I was surprised to discover about you?
I have no idea.
You're a car guy.
Oh, yeah. Huge. I am a huge car person. Yeah, I love cars.
How many cars have you got?
Depends what counts.
Well, something with four wheels and an engine of some kind.
More than four. More than four. I'll say that.
Do you know why?
Love cars.
Yeah, but why?
Who knows? Why? I also like the color green. I don't know why I like the color green. I've never lost my pre-adolescent. When I was 6, I thought cars were the greatest thing in the world. When I was 5, that has never changed. I have no idea why. It's just a kind of permanent condition of my Malcolmness.
Are they all fossil fuel cars? You know where I'm going
but I
here,
changed
right?
them. I changed them so often that
What?
This is why it's hard for me to answer the question of how many cars I have.
All right.
But
do they burn petrol?
Yes, they do. Oh, yeah.
All right.
Yes.
So you know where I'm going here. I mean, here's a guy who desperately wants the world to be a better and kinder place. And you're sending us all to hell in a climate change basket, Malcolm.
Well, my cars are all used cars. And I think it's very important from an environmental standpoint to buy used cars, because the primary source of the environmental burden of a car is its manufacture, not its use, right? So that's one way of answering the question. And also, I don't drive my cars a lot. So I'm not. It's not.
No, you're really a car guy. What, you just go and polish them from time to time?
Yeah, I mean, my work is 6 miles from my home, and I basically drive 12 miles a day. That's a modest amount to drive a car. It's not like I'm putting on thousands and thousands and thousands of miles a month.
It's so interesting. See, I mean, I would have thought that you were a bicycle sort of a chap.
I have a bicycle. Oh, I love bicycle. When I lived in the city, I bicycled everywhere. I like to avail myself of as many. I'm a big runner. I'm not a. My affection for cars does not crowd out my concerns about living an environmentally sustainable life. Do you know what time it is? I have to go at the top of the hour.
You must go now because you're 2 minutes late. Thank you so much for talking to me and giving me so much time and giving us all so many things to think about.
Thank you so much. This has been great fun.
Thank you for listening to Kim Hill Wants to Know, hosted by me, fairly obviously, Kim Hill. Kim Hill Wants to Know is produced by Melanie Phipps with help from Liz Garton and Brianna Uratich-Greg. Graphics were designed by Robert Whittaker, and the original theme music was composed by the Phoenix Foundation. Particular thanks to RNZ's audio engineers, who've made everything sound, well, beautiful. Follow and listen on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or any podcast app so you don't miss an episode, or to get every episode delivered free to your phone. Listen out for my conversation with veteran New Yorker reporter and adventurer John Lee Anderson about his extraordinary life.